When you have an equation in this form, x minus h squared plus y minus k squared is equal to r squared, so you have an equation in this format, then if r squared, so if the number here on the right hand side is bigger than 0, then you have a circle of radius r and center hk. If r squared happens to equal 0, so if you have this and you're equal to 0, then you have just a point and your point is located at hk. That makes sense to us because, again, if we were in that format and r squared would equal to 0, well, that would mean that we'd be moving up, down, left, and right 0 units from that point, which would just make us a point. If r squared happens to be less than 0, then you don't have a graph. And that would be because, if you think about it, if r squared is less than 0, so if it's a negative number, when I try to find a radius, I'm going to end up with an imaginary number, and I can't graph imaginary numbers. So let's look at determining whether, given one of those equations, we are a circle, a point, or we have no graph. The directions tell us that if we have a graph of a circle, we want to give the radius in the center, and if we have an equation that represents a point, we need to name the point. So let's start with number 8. Well, example 8 says that we have x plus 7 squared plus y minus 2 squared is equal to 1. Well, are we in standard form? Is this the same form that we have there? We are. So now we have to determine, is this number here, is the number 1, is it greater than 0, equal to 0, or less than 0? Well, 1 is greater than 0, which means that I have a circle. If I have a circle, what I'm asked to find is the center and the radius. Well, the center of this circle is going to be located at h and k. Well, h and k are going to be the opposite numbers of the ones that you find in there. So a plus 7 means negative 7. A minus 2 means a positive 2. So I found my center. Now I need to find my radius. Well, this 1 is really r squared. So if r squared is equal to 1, taking the square root of both sides gives me what r is. R would just equal 1. So here my radius is equal to 1. So I found that example 8 represented a circle with center at negative 7, 2 and radius of 1. Right, example 9. Well, the problem with example 9 is that I am not in that standard form. Well, the way that I would get in that standard form is to complete the square. Alright, well now we have x's and y's. So the very first thing we want to do is group. So here's my x terms, x squared minus 8x. Here's my y term, y squared. Here's my constant, plus 5 equals 0. So I need to complete the square on anything that isn't a perfect square in terms of my variables. Well, if I take a look here, x squared minus 8x is not a perfect square, but y squared is a perfect square. And the way that I know that is if I have to say squared to say it, then I'm a perfect squared. Or if you look here, it's just one single term being squared. So I don't need to complete the square on that. And the constant's just going to move to the other side. So how do we complete the square again? Well, again, I would write x squared minus 8x plus blank. Keep my y squared, don't need to do anything with that. Move my constant to the right, so that would equal negative 5. Now if I add a plus blank on the left, I need to add a plus blank on the right. Well, what goes in that blank? It's going to be half of that coefficient squared. Well, half of a negative 8 quantity squared, well, half of negative 8 is negative 4, and negative 4 squared gives 16, so the number I'm adding to both sides of the equation is 16. Now I need to factor x squared minus 8x plus 16. Well, that factored as something squared, and the something was my variable, and then again, half of this term. So what is half of negative 8? Half of negative 8 is negative 4. Then my y squared stays as it is. If I add negative 5 plus 16, I end up with positive 11. So this in standard form is x minus 4 squared plus y squared equals 11. So take a look at the number 11. Is this greater than 0, equal to 0, or less than 0? Well, 11 is greater than 0. Since I'm greater than 0, I am a circle. Right, if I'm a circle, the directions say we'll name the center and also give the radius. Well, the center of this circle, again, would be found by looking at h and k. Well, h is going to be the opposite of the number here with x, so the opposite of a negative 4 is positive 4, and k is going to be the opposite of the number here with y. Well, there is no number there with y, but I can always write 0. Well, what's the radius? Well, remember, this 11 represents r squared, so if r squared is equal to 11, if I take the square root, then the radius is going to be the square root of 11. So my radius is the square root of 11, and my center for the circle is 4, 0. Let's look at example 10. Same thing, first we need to group. So, put my x's together, x squared plus 2x, put my y's together, plus y squared plus 8y, put my constants together, plus 6 equals 0. I'm going to have to complete the square with my x's and with my y's because neither one of these is a perfect square. So start off by saying x squared plus 2x plus blank plus y squared plus 8y plus blank. Move your constant to the right equals -6. And if I have two blanks on the left, I need two blanks on the right. Figure out what goes in those blanks. For this red one, it would be half of 2 squared. Well, what is half of 2 squared? Half of 2 is 1, and 1 squared is 1. So I add 1 to both sides of the equation. Right? What about for my y's? It's going to be half of 8 squared. Well, half of 8 is 4, and 4 squared gives 16. So I'm adding 16 to both sides of the equation. Okay, let's factor. This is going to factor as x, and then whatever half of 2 is, well, half of a positive 2 is a positive 1. Quantity squared, and now plus. Same thing here. We need to have something squared. Well, it's going to be the variable, which is y, and then half of this term, well, half of 8 is 4, so y plus 4, quantity squared. Add the right-hand side, -6 plus 1 plus 16 gives a positive 11. Well, what kind of number is 11? 11 is a number that's bigger than 0. Since it's a number that's bigger than 0, I know I have a circle. If I have a circle, then I need to name the center and the radius. Well, the center of this circle is h and k. Again, it's the numbers opposite with that. So the opposite of a positive 1, -1. Opposite of a positive 4, -4. My radius is, well, again, if r squared is 11, to find my radius, r would equal the square root of 11. So r is the square root of 11. So I have a circle with center at -1, -4, and radius of the square root of 11. Let's look at example 11. Same thing, I need to group. Well, here are my x terms, x squared plus 10x. Here are my y terms, plus y squared, constant, plus 25 equals 0. I only need to complete the square on the x because y is already a perfect square. So I write x squared plus 10x plus blank plus y squared, move your constant to the right, is equal to -25. If there's a plus blank on the left, I need a plus blank on the right. Well, what am I adding in that blank? Well, it's going to be half of 10 quantity squared. Well, half of 10 is 5, and 5 squared is 25. So I'm adding 25 to both sides. Factor here on the left, well, this will factor as my variable of x, and then half of 10, well, half of 10 is a positive 5. Y squared was already a perfect square. Add the right-hand side, -25 plus 25 is 0. I'm in standard form. What kind of number do I have here? Well, r squared is 0, and 0 is equal to 0, and that means that I have a point. Again, that makes sense to us because I would graph the center and then move up, down, left, and right 0 units away, which means I don't move away from the center, making me just a point. Well, what is that point? Well, the point is determined by h and k, so h, opposite of the number with x, is a -5. K, opposite the number with y, well, there is no number, but I can write 0. So this was a point, and the point was at -5, 0. Last one, example 12. Same thing. Start by grouping. my x's, x squared minus 4x, group your y's, plus y squared plus 6y, constants, 20 equals 0. I'm going to have to complete the square for my x and complete the square for my y. So I write x squared minus 4x plus blank plus y squared plus 6y plus blank equals, move your constant to the right, negative 20 plus blank plus blank. Again, there's two blanks on your left. You need two blanks on your right. Well, what goes in the first one? It's going to be half of a negative 4 quantity squared. Well, half of negative 4 is negative 2, and negative 2 squared gives positive 4, right? What goes in the other blank? It's going to be half of 6 quantity squared. Well, half of 6 is 3, and 3 squared is 9. Factor the left-hand side. So this is going to factor as something squared. What's going to be the variable, and then whatever half of negative 4 is. Well, half of negative 4 is negative 2. Over here, I have something squared. It's going to be the variable, and then whatever half of 6 is. Well, half of 6 is a positive 3, equals the right-hand side. So negative 20 plus 4 plus 9 is a negative 7. Well, r squared is negative 7. Negative 7 is a number that's less than 0, which means I have no graph. And when I have no graph, I just write no graph and I am done. Well, that's it on this section on circles.